Welcome, 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 and one more welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming out, joining our part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, anybody who can form a complete thought about where we are in America and how we got here, where we might go from here. We want to provide as many different perspectives as we can directly to you, the public, unedited and unaltered, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. We might have a renaissance. With us today, it is our privilege to have postdoctorate fellow Daniel Yudkin. He's in the psychology department at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a postdoctorate fellow at the psychology department and Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also a postdoctorate research in the psychology department at Yale University. His research has been published in scientific journals such as Nature Communications, very prestigious, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, National Nature Human Behavior. Since 2017, he's worked with the nonprofit organization More in Common to leverage insights from social science to understand and bridge political divides. His research report, which we're going to be covering here, Hidden Tribes, Study of America's Polarized Landscape and the Perception Gap, How False Impressions Are Pulling Americans Apart, have been highlighted in multiple presidential campaigns and featured in over 1,500 news articles, including The New Yorker, Atlantic, Washington Post, Financial Times, NPR, CNN, Front Page, and The New York Times. We'll be looking at that too. I've given interviews. He's given interviews about this research on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, very prestigious, BBC World News also, and authored an accompanied opinion piece about the work in the New York Times entitled The Psychology of Political Polarization. We're going to be talking about that a little bit. In 2011, he enrolled in the graduate school in social psychology at New York University under the mentorship of professors Yakov Trope and J. Van Bavel. So for everybody watching at home, J. Van Bavel is a well-established authority in the field of political polarization. My research focused on moral flexibility, how people's views about right and wrong change according to their group membership. We've been talking about that here a lot. Some people refer to that as tribalism. I wrote about this research, which could help reduce bias in our communications and organizations, in the New York Times article titled The Roots of Implicit Bias. After graduate school, I pursued a postdoctorate research at Yale University with Professor Molly Crockett, studying how transformative experiences at multi-day mass gatherings, such as the Burning Man Festival in Central Nevada, infamous, can change people's circle of moral regard, causing them to show altruism to distant others. These results show how intense social experiences from music festivals to corporate retreats can change our willingness to cooperate with others. And this is a little bit of the research that we wanted to talk about today, the perception gap, how false impressions are pulling us apart, and the famous New York Times article, The Psychology of Political Polarization. But before we get to that, let's check in and see how well we did. Postdoctorate fellow, did I get anything wrong? Do we need to correct something, restate anything at all?
No, that all sounds pretty good, Marcus.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you the question I haven't asked in a few weeks, but this is one of my favorite ones. And before you answer, if you could answer as both as an academic and just as an American with two working eyeballs, as I say. Pretend I've been in a cave for the last 5 to 7 years. Why is this an issue? Why do we have a perception? Do we have a perception gap? Do we have a problem of political polarization? In your words, as both a person living in this stew pot we're in and as an academic studying it, pretend I just woke up from a coma. I've been in a cave. I don't know what's going on. Who's Donald Trump? What's going on? Why is this an important issue?
Yeah. So I guess your question is, is polarization real, and what's causing it, and what is this perception gap? So
basically,
just to kind of fill you in on what the perception gap is. The perception gap is actually very simple. It's basically the idea that people perceive their political opponents to have more extreme views than they actually do. So, for example, if you were to ask Republicans, how many, for example, what percentage of Republicans think that most. So here you're saying, here we're asking Republicans what Democrats actually think. And Republicans are asking, what percent of Democrats do you think that most police are bad people? And they think that the vast majority of Democrats would endorse this. And in fact, actually, the number is far, far lesser than that. And so this basic idea is just that we tend to attribute far more extreme views to our political opponents than they actually have. Now, why is this happening? Well, the research that I've done as part of, so one of the aspects of this bio that you so thoughtfully explained, there's one component that's missing from there, and that is that I'm also an associate director of research and a senior advisor at this nonprofit organization called More in Common. I think you referred to that briefly. But More in Common is an international organization. We've been working on this problem for many, many years. And the research that you're showing on the screen right now is done in collaboration with them. And we did this work called the Hidden Tribes Project, which is basically looking at the ways in which our political landscape can be divided according to 7 different what we call hidden tribes. So typically the narrative, and we think about politics today, we think about this sort of like us versus them, left versus right, red versus blue kind of story. This sort of, we got 50% of the country over here, 50% of the country over there, and they're just battling it out. The reality is actually far more complicated than that. And in fact, actually what we find is that when you really dig down, you actually find 7 different groups ranging from progressive activists on the far left to devoted conservatives on the far right that are that differ significantly in their views and the way that they engage and interact in political and social conversations, and their relationship to politics in general. And it turns out that maybe perhaps not surprisingly, the loudest voices in the room are the ones that are on the far extreme. So you have the progressive activists, the wing groups, exactly. So you have the progressive activists on the left that represents about 8% of the population. You have the traditional and devoted conservatives on the right that represents about 25% of the population. Devoted conservatives represent only 6% of the population. And these are the groups that are they tend to be far more active online. They tend to be far more willing and interested in having political conversations with their friends and family and sharing their own political views. They're more likely to consume and be regular consumers of news media and things like that. And so this group simultaneously is more active in the political conversation, and they're more vocal in the political conversation, and they have the most sort of ideologically rigid views on the respective sides of the divide. And what happens is that because these people are taking up the most oxygen, their political opponents tend to attribute to that side of the political spectrum the views of the extremely vocal minority. And so when Democrats are asked, when we're asking Democrats, what do you think the Republicans actually think about things? What they're really calling to mind are the opinions of the people who are in those very small extreme wing groups, not the opinions of the people in the party affiliation writ large. And so what this leads to is this perception gap where we are really, when we call to mind our political opponents, what we're really calling to mind are the stereotypical caricatures of the people on that side of the divide, and not the complex, much more nuanced range of people that fall into that category writ large. So that is really kind of the phenomenon of what is causing this perception gap. And so to answer your question again, yes, political polarization is happening. Obviously, like, you don't need to look around and just see just the degree of lack of empathy, political animosity, and general moral outrage that's happening on everything related to cultural issues, political issues, social issues, especially on social media. So that is certainly happening, but it's oftentimes caused in large part by these misperceptions that we hold about our political opponents.
Has the perception gap always existed, or has it been relatively small, let's say in the 60s and 70s, and then it just got wildly out of whack somewhere around the time Trump became president? Is that roughly what's going on?
That's a great question. I can't actually speak to that because we don't have the data that that can answer that question directly. So what we can say, though, is that perceptions of political polarization and affective polarization, this sort of sense of negative emotions being held towards and negative attitudes held towards our political opponents, that has certainly skyrocketed in the past 5, 10, 15 years. And, even at a greater scope than that, we are more divided than we were. Now, whether or not this division is largely caused by these misperceptions is something that remains to be determined. We just don't have the data to go back that far and see how the perception gap has changed over time.
So we don't know. And just for everybody following along at home, an easy way that I came to understand this was the size of the gray bar indicates how bad it is. So if you're the further apart the blue dot and the red dot are, and the larger that gray bar is the larger the perception gap. Now you can look at the numbers at the far right and it'll give you percentage, but just for everybody following along at home, kind of a rough corollary was if you're looking at questions and they got a huge gray bar, like properly controlled immigration can be good for America, perception gap's 33%. That's the largest gray bar. That's the largest distance between the blue dot and the red dot. And that's just an easy way to tell. So like we're really off on how people feel about immigration. We're really off on racism and Muslims, a little bit less on sexism, a little bit less on government, but still an issue. Then we go to Republicans, really, really widely off on most police are bad people. I'm proud to be an American. It's important that men are protected from false accusations, and the U.S. should have properly, completely open borders. Wow, just really big, 30% are around there. Can I ask you this though? Have these hidden tribes always existed then? If we can't tell how far back the perception gap goes, are these tribes the way that Americans have sorted themselves out, or is that also something relatively new we've seen develop in the last 15 years? Were the wings always this small? Were they smaller and expanded? Were there more, like I've heard there were more moderates in the past. Postdoctoral fellow, what was the tribal position in the past? Was it always like this? And how recently did it become in this formation we're looking at here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're identifying here is in some ways a phenomenon that is common to all conflicts. There's just sort of a ubiquitous feature of social conflict is that you have militant and vocal minorities on the wings that tend to drive polarization, that tend to be less flexible in their views and want people to sort of and are really sort of like holding fast to their own particular viewpoints to the detriment of anything that cuts against that. And one thing that we've also identified is this group that we call the exhausted majority. The exhausted majority is a group of people that comprises about 2/3 of the country. That's just a little bit more flexible in their views. They tend to not necessarily cohere in their political beliefs. They don't answer the same way across all different items. Sometimes they think of this way about immigration, but sometimes they feel this way about abortion, for example. So they're more flexible. They're frustrated. They just want both sides to sort of find a progress and a path to common sense solutions. And they're also forgotten in the political conversation. They're just less active on all kinds of media. Now, has the exhausted majority always existed? To a certain extent, there's always been a middle group in American culture in particular. Moderates have always been, independents have always been a sizable faction in American culture. Currently, and more, I think that there is less and less tolerance for people who subscribe to those views. This idea of there being people who are trying to find compromise. The idea of compromise is increasingly feeling like a form of capitulation or of compromising one's values in a way that is increasingly frowned upon. And so, again, we don't have the data that necessarily, because we did this analysis in 2017 for the first time, we didn't do an analysis of hidden tribes in like the 1980s or 70s. So we don't have that exact data, but what overall the trends seem to suggest is that there is a diminishing degree of tolerance for people who would fall in what we call the exhausted majority.
So we have the exhausted majority at 2/3 of the country now, but there's trends showing it's going to become depressed. People just aren't really up to listening to moderates or tolerating moderates. There's going to be fewer moderates in the future.
Well, it's hard to make that sort of prediction about what's going to happen in the future. I do think that there is some reason for optimism. And I think that there are important questions that are being raised about what role the moderates are playing in society these days. I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been aware of this sort of rise in this group called No Labels, which is advocating for a third-party candidate in the 2024 election. There's also some legitimate concerns that are being raised about this movement because they suggest that that the third-party candidates tend to detract and take votes away from Democrats rather than Republicans to a greater extent, and so it could end up being a sort of a spoiler for the election. So the two-party system that we're in is always constantly exacerbating this phenomenon and making it such that there are genuine concerns about the possibility of introducing moderate candidates in the political process. To the extent, just to put my cards at the table, I certainly would not want to see another Trump presidency. And to the extent that, a moderate candidate could hasten that likelihood, that certainly would not be a good thing. So political moderation, centrism needs to also be tempered with an understanding of the reality of the political facts on the ground. And so it's a delicate balance here between advocating for flexibility and moderation, while at the same time, ensuring that the democracy stays healthy.
I remember Andrew Yang was trying to form a third party and trying to reach out to some Republicans and moderates. And when he announced this party, high-level members of the Democratic Party told him to shut up and go away. I also remember when the People's Party, which is the group of Bernie Sanders supporters, couldn't get Bernie to actually endorse the third party, so they tried to raise it on with him. Same thing, no love from the Democratic Party. So it's going to be a tough sell. It's going to be a tough sell. And when you also add that spoiler room in there, we can look at the election with Perot and Clinton and Bush Sr., and people were saying that's what got Clinton in, was Perot. So there's some hard evidence of that.
Right, exactly. And so, when we talk about that sort of thing, what we need to be talking about are like structural changes to the way in which the elections get conducted. So that includes things like, the Forward Party is talking about things like ranked choice voting, which I think could help to mitigate the possibility of a third party spoiler, that type of thing. And so, those, we need to be thinking creatively about ways in which we can, promote the type of reasonable dialogue and promote the values of what the exhausted majority in America is looking for, while at the same time doing that in a way that is, with that, designing a political system that could allow for that without necessarily like ruining a two-party election.
Fair enough. One of the things I always point out on this series is that most of the world's modern democracies do not follow the form America takes. We have what's called a two-party winner-take-all style system. Most people have a multi-party parliamentary system where you have a coalition of parties come together and you definitely get a few people representing you. That's the way most of the world does. And when America tried to insert democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, we did not try to implement our own. we implemented the other version. So we don't actually insert our own version of democracy when we go, you guys need to be democratic. We insert this other version. And when you talk to some of those other countries, especially the Japanese and some like the Germans, they think our form of government is insane. Just, why don't you tell 49% of the country to screw off? That'll be a good idea. Oh, that's perfect. Oh, you have disruptions and people are angry at each other? How'd that happen? You know, and they always have these systems where you got 2/3 have to come together before they have a coalition government. So there's always a majority before they do stuff. And yeah, sometimes you have governments that can't form. I think like in Belgium, they didn't have one for a year and a half, but that's abnormal. So I totally agree with you. And then the spoiler event, boy, that's all over the place. I mean, it's going to be tough to see there. Is there another reform we could achieve to reduce political polarization other than a third party?
Well, I think this ranked choice voting, I mean, it's a math problem. You know, it's like what we're dealing with is an antiquated system of primaries in which, you know, this is something that was really invented to solve a problem that doesn't exist anymore, which is like, how do we, you know, create these nominations and then ultimately, you know, have a more logical election. But of course the delegation system, you know, the electoral college, it's been well documented. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a psychologist. Sure. So you know, I'm sort of reaching at the limits of my knowledge in terms of political systems here. But it's been well documented just how damaging these types of arrangements and how antiquated they are to deal with the current political problem. So I think, you know, just pure math when it comes to sort of like, you know, ranked choice voting, that sort of thing. Other things that have been well documented, ending gerrymandering, all those sorts of things are clear structural solutions to a problem that's really a result of the fact that we're dealing with a system that's hundreds of years old.
I've heard that. Eliminate gerrymandering, eliminate the filibuster in the Senate, force everyone to vote like Australia, automatic registration at the DMVs when you go, ranked choice voting, parliamentary system, multi-party system. Let's pretend for a second, just pretend, we live in a country that hasn't been able to pass an amendment in, I think, 60 to 80 years. And we're super polarized. And the reforms you're talking about require an amendment. What other options, professional psychologist, do we have to bring people together?
We need to be creating environments in which people have an opportunity to interact with people with whom they disagree. So programs, I think, you know, I think some politicians have been talking about programs of service. I think oftentimes, you know, Army service, Peace Corps, those types of service are opportunities for people to come together with people that they wouldn't necessarily interact with. There's an enormous amount of geographic division where people who are liberals, Democrats tend to congregate in cities. People who are Republicans, conservatives tend to be in rural areas. And this type of physical separation between people is at the heart of the misunderstandings and differences in values that tend to arise. And so I believe that finding ways of just getting people to participate in the same activities together, to be in the same room as people with whom they disagree is a really important solution, because so much of the time, once people end up having a conversation, they end up finding that they have just a lot more in common than they think. And the opposite of that is that there's so many people who just simply don't have they don't know anyone. They have no one in their friend group that holds different views than them. It's a sort of a cultural monolith that we're dealing with in so many instances. And so people oftentimes when that happens, it allows you to create this caricature, this monster in your mind of what someone who holds different views from you actually believes. And that ultimately is really damaging, because it makes you think that this is a zero-sum, win-at-all-cost type situation, when in fact, actually, there's a lot more conversations that we can have where we can make progress on issues that we all care about. So I think that's one. I also think that there has been a lack of imagination when it comes to the way that we think about and communicate about the issues that we all care about. We have been so focused on defeating the enemy within on winning this zero-sum game that we've lost our ability to raise our imaginations and think creatively about the world that we actually want to create for ourselves 5 or 10 years in the future. What are the features of the society that we're trying to create and build together? What are the values that we all can come together around and think about and talk about and care about as Americans? We've become so entrenched in our own views, and we are in such an embattled mindset that we have sort of doubled down on ways of thinking and talking that have worked in the past, and we're prohibiting ourselves from imagining new ways and of imagining that, they call the social contract. The social contract is this implicit agreement between citizens about what we owe each other, what our responsibilities are as citizens, and what the government owes to us. And we've really sort of moved away and started to limit ourselves in terms of examining and reevaluating that social contract in terms of in light of the new things that we've learned about ourselves and our world over the past 10 or 20 years in this new sort of era that we're in the 21st century. So I think that what we ultimately need, in addition to the things that we've also talked about, is we need to imagine and to allow our creative minds to turn to new ways of thinking and talking about the society that we're trying to create for ourselves.
Let's say people start getting out there and they start talking to each other and they go, oh, find out we have common values. You're in rural Kentucky and I'm in downtown San Francisco, and we have common values. Does that mean that they will vote the same when it comes to voting time?
I don't necessarily think it's about voting the same. They don't necessarily need to vote the same. What we need is functional disagreement. We don't need to all agree. We're not all trying to get on the aim of this whole thing is not to get everyone to start voting the exact same way, or to all start singing Kumbaya and holding hands and dancing around a campfire. The purpose is to have functional, productive disagreement about things that actually matter, instead of the things that are these wedge issues that are pulling us apart. So it's about refocusing our conversation, our dialogue on the questions that are really relevant for the society that we're trying to build, and rather than focusing on these incredibly niche issues about bathrooms and who these altercations that happen in very, very niche areas, these particular books that include 1 or 2 words. These are like wedge issues that have been created by people who thrive and who benefit by inflaming people's moral outrage, and who derive material benefit by keeping people divided.
Sure.
So it's not about agreeing; it's about disagreeing well.
Sure, but at the end of the day, I am okay losing. I'm okay with my bill not getting through. I'm not as angry at the other side, but they still managed to get a vote up to ban certain books, and people had to choose if they were going to vote for it or not. And I chose to go with the banning the books, even though, hey, I'm way more cool with the liberals and I understand them, but this is the vote that was there. These are the 2 choices. I get an A or a B, and I'm not going to vote for you. I mean, I understand you. I like you. I'm not angry. We can reduce the amount of affective polarization, but I'm still going to vote for transgender bathrooms, or ending the cops, or on the other verse, banning books and banning CRT. And it won't affect the vote necessarily.
The bans are coming from the only reason anyone would ever ban a book is because they're afraid of what the book of the language that the book contains. The only reason that people are ever afraid of the language a book contains is because they believe themselves to be a part of an existential battle for the spirit and the soul of a nation, when it comes to the types of things that are happening in these little lines of text.
Sure.
So the only reason that we're having conversations about banning books is because we have tricked ourselves into believing that we're in this zero-sum battle with people who present an existential risk to our way of life and our value system.
Okay.
So
Okay.
so it wouldn't so the world that we would ideally be living in is a one in which, yes, there are there is a candidate in A and a candidate B potentially. I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon, but the candidate B is talking about different ways of solving the same problem and trying to create the same world. That we're a world in which there's fairness, there's justice, there's opportunity, there's less economic inequality. There's access to the features that make for a worthy and flourishing human life. So we've come to an agreement about what we're trying to create, and we just haven't figured out exactly the right way to get there. Those are the types of agreements I'd like an opportunity to vote between two candidates that are discussing those types of issues, rather than one candidate who's trying to ban some book that contains a couple lines of text that they find offensive.
Actually return candidates to having elections based upon policy differences instead of ideological competitions.
Exactly.
Okay. But just for everybody at home, just because we're getting people to understand each other doesn't mean that it's going to stop polarizing votes immediately, but it should reduce the tension over time, which encourages politicians to try to reach out and go for CRT or safe rooms because those are identity issues. Like you said, they're not actually trying to get policy governance. It's not actually in line with their liberal or conservative perspective. It's a cultural issue they can use to signal to their base that I'm like you, so vote for me. And exactly. We need to discourage that and calm that down and not have so many people interested in that.
It's an incentive structure. Politicians are like machines that are trying to say the thing that is going to get them the most votes, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
And so, the polling shows, right, that like the thing that's getting people to excited about your candidacy is because you're bashing CRT, or you're talking about these very sort of hot button issues. If we turn down the temperature and we focus our attention on the conversations and the policy issues that actually matter, then the differences between politicians is going to be about those things, and they're going to be less focused on trying to say these things that are inflaming our sensibilities, because those aren't going to be the things that are going to test well in the focus room.
We want to make it where the voters just aren't that interested anymore. You get two politicians, and one of them says, I'm going to do all identity politics, and the other one goes, I'm going to focus on the issues. And generally the voters go, I'm over the identity politics. I'm more interested in the guy or the woman or the they them who's focused on policy issues. And we want to encourage a changing landscape that gets to where voters feel that way and they respond to that. And they're just not responding to the I'm angry, let's attack them over some cultural issue anymore as much.
Exactly. And of course there are really, just to add to that, there are important issues that are at stake, right? Like there are important questions that we have to deal with regards to trans issues and trans women competing in sports and et cetera, et cetera. So that's not to say that some of these issues around gender identity, around race, are not important ones to include in our sort of portfolio of things that we're considering. But right now, those things are taking an outsized importance in our political discourse, to the exclusion of some of the other questions that actually matter.
So the key is to bridge gaps and to get people to talk to each other. One of the questions I've always had, because I've heard other people say this, was I have family who are Republican and live in Los Angeles, and I'm not a Republican. And I also have family who live in rural Texas. And when I talk to the Republicans in LA about LGBTQ and CRT or transgender, they're not as upset about it. What they're mostly about is economics, money, tax benefits, etc. Maybe a little bit less regulation. When I talk to my relatives in rural Texas, the cultural issues are very much important. God, guns, gays. I think Obama called it that way. I didn't. President Obama did. And so I'm wondering, if I'm in downtown San Francisco, super liberal, and I go down to the Starbucks and I meet someone who calls themselves a Republican, and I have a conversation, and it turns out they're okay with LGBTQ people, and they kind of understand that climate change is happening because they see the sea level rise. And maybe they believe you don't need an assault weapon because it's so dense in San Francisco. And I go, you know what? Connection made. I just bridged a gap. Did I really do something, or did I hang out with a Republican who's largely had to accept the values of that area? And if I really wanted to make a gap bridge, I need to talk to the guy who lives in rural Kentucky, who's not surrounded by liberals and is under no pressure to understand liberals, and probably has no connection to any liberals or watches anything on liberal. Shouldn't that be really the guy a liberal needs to make a connection with?
Yes, definitely. But let's do it one step at a time.
Okay, nobody brings this up. They go, get out there and make a friend. And I go, I made a friend in San Francisco and he agrees LGBTQ is cool. So I can assume all Republicans are cool with it now.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
I don't hear anyone bring this up at all. It's
right.
Just make a friend.
So it's a great point. I mean, it's a gradual thing. If we're talking about the person in San Francisco who says, I've never met a Republican I can even have a conversation with, then the first step would be, let's introduce them to the sort of soft Republican, the rhino or whatever.
Thank you.
And at least get them to change their mind. They can maybe that interaction would help them to go from someone who's like, all Republicans are evil, to like, some Republicans are evil and some of them aren't.
Right.
Let's start there. Now, would that make them then, is there the possibility that sort of small gradual attitude change would then make them more willing? So a friend of theirs is like, you know what, we're going hiking in Kentucky. Would you want to go? And before they might be like, oh my God, I couldn't even imagine visiting Kentucky in the first place. But you know what? I had an interesting conversation with a Republican. I'm still a little nervous about it, and I'm kind of on the fence. But I'll check it out. Let's go on this trip, and let's go visit Kentucky. So now I'm in Kentucky, and I go to a coffee shop there, have another conversation. Now, is that conversation going to go well? Well, probably not, given the description that you just made. This is a person who is opposed to all to LGBT issues, who is highly in support of gun rights and et cetera, the things you mentioned. So at that point, then it becomes a question of like, what is the context and what is the mindset that you're bringing into this conversation? Because a simple conversation with someone you disagree with about issues that you disagree with is very likely to go south pretty quickly. And then suddenly you have an exacerbation of this sense of difference, because we really do have different values, right? I mean, we talked about the perception gap. There are things that we're wrong about each other. There's also not, things that we're right about each other. Like when if there's fundamental differences about people's rights to get married, for example, which is at this point, has been a conversation, is now fairly settled in the United States, given the recent court rulings. But still, you have a lot of people who sort of find this to be who find this to be fundamentally opposed to their core value systems. Now, what does a conversation look like between people who are on opposite sides of that debate? That is probably not going to end well. And so, there are ways in which conversations can be helpful, and there are a sort of context in which we can and attitudes that we can bring into the conversation that could help make the conversation as productive and fruitful as possible. Let me ask questions about you. Oftentimes, just being heard, just feeling heard, can increase people's sense of closeness and help to bridge that divide. So instead of me going to you and being like, oh, okay, let me tell you my opinion, let me tell you how we disagree, why don't I just ask questions about what you believe? Maybe I disagree with that, but let me just let you express yourself. Let me let you say your piece. And that simple act of communication, that's actually one-sided, where I'm just listening, can have a lot of positive consequences down the road. So we need to have conversations. We need to do them in the right way. We need to have them gradually, and we ultimately, need to allow this to be a very slow process and realize that there's going to be significant limitations to this type of approach as we go forward.
So it's fair to say this could work, but you have to have the conversations in the right way. You just walk up to somebody and start spouting off, it could go wrong, and you could actually make polarization worse. Is that fair?
I think that's 100% right. Yeah, if you're digging into these really hot button issues, and you're just gonna try to make your voice heard over theirs, that is not going to end well. I think that the more listening that we can do, the more that people are going to feel heard. And again, feeling heard is half the battle.
I agree. I appreciate you bringing that up. So some people have said that. I don't think it's as highlighted as much as it is. So I see a lot of people saying, we need to have better conversations, get to know each other. And a lot of people are in like the notes underneath are going, you have to do it the right way. There's a certain way to do it. And if you just run up in someone's face and start talking politics, it could go very badly and do the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. So I think it's an important warning. I think you were already getting at this, but let's say you had a magic wand. Poof! 200 million people agree this is the right strategy and they want to get involved. How long till we heal America? 2 weeks?
2 days. You get 200 million people all on the same page. That's great. We're there. What does it mean to heal? I think the question is like, what does it mean to heal America? There's always going to be disagreement in America. People are always going to feel as though their value system is the way to go, and so we need to be careful about what we mean when we define what it means to heal America. I think
pre-Trump level polarization,
right?
2015. How long to get it back to just the 2015 level of polarization, which was Obama Tea Party bad, but no, at least not Trump bad.
Right. Gosh. It's hard for me to make a time estimate. I think that I can tell you some of the things that need to happen for that to
Sure.
So we need to change our norms on social media. There needs to be new algorithms that get introduced to social media that help people to get outside of this sort of like enforcement mechanism of moral outrage. There's a lot of research suggesting that tweets and messages that spark outgroup animosity that are sort of like portraying the outgroup as the enemy, and tweets that contain emotional and negative words tend to be retweeted and go viral more often. So ideally, we learn the lessons of the past 10 years about how social media can bring us awry, and we start to change some of those norms and incentives. So for example, maybe we can introduce a button on social media that's like, oh, this changed my mind on something, right? Or fostering attitudes of openness and dialogue, and have that be the incentive that is driving people's engagement on these sites rather than tribalism. So can we get people to, instead of having changing your mind be a weakness, can we get changing your mind a news article that changes one's mind? Can that be the kind of thing that gets promoted? So that's the first thing. And then, if we're able to do that sort of thing, I do think that in the next 5 to 10 years, I believe that there is a path to restoring a degree of functional democracy and healthy dialogue that I think can happen. I don't think that Donald Trump. I think if Donald Trump is around that he is anathema to those characteristics, and so I think that Donald Trump needs to basically leave the picture in order for this to be able to restore a sense of normalcy, because Donald Trump is not normal. So once he is out of the picture and he's no longer an active voice in the political process, I think that will help. I think that changing norms of social media will help. So let's say you ask me, I'll say between 5 and 10 years. I do think that sort of restoration is possible.
And that's both people having the right conversations and let's change the algorithms on social media.
Yeah.
At the same time. Fair enough. What about the fact that, as you said, the algorithms have increased the amount of traffic? These are all private sector companies. Their goal is to make a profit. The more traffic they have, the more money they make. And according to American law, once you are incorporated, you can, by law, only have one goal: make as much money for the shareholders as possible. How do we convince corporations that it's in their profit margin to destroy the thing that brought them record profits when that's against the law for them to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm certainly not familiar with like corporate legal restrictions, but I do think that suppose you're Facebook. There's every reason for you to want people to have a healthy relationship with your platform, because a healthy relationship, if you're thinking about it in pure raw financial terms, people who have a healthy relationship with their platform are going to be more engaged, they're going to be more attentive, they might use it more, and so there's reasons for platforms to want to cultivate healthy relationships with their users. And I think that this is just a question of changing norms. More and more, the public wants things. For example, the increase in the desire for security and privacy when it comes to the use of social media. That didn't used to be a thing. Mark Zuckerberg, when he first introduced social media, was saying the era of privacy is over, and he was so wrong about that.
Right.
And I think that we could optimistically look towards a similar change where we could say the era of outrage is over. The era of people of social media companies deliberately playing up these sorts of tribalistic messaging is replaced by an era in which people are in which what is getting promoted and what people are looking for when they engage with the site is a reasonable, good faith conversation amongst people whose opinions they respect. So that, I think, from you put it in purely financial terms, I think that there's every reason to think that sort of engagement could be a highly profitable incentive for social media companies who are looking to try to predict the next set of value systems that's being endorsed by the general public. And more, this is what people are saying that they want.
Right. So it comes back down to the people have to start wanting this stuff. They have to start saying, I'm not interested in
demand politics. It as a the public needs to demand it.
Yeah, the public has to demand. Politicians are focused on the issues, not identity things, and the public has to say, I'm not as interested in social media sites that just make me angry instead of actually informing me or making me feel more connected. So it still comes down to the public. The public has to want these things. That's the main driver of the change. Is that accurate?
I know that many would say that this is that we need to be aiming at changing laws, we need to be changing structures, we need to be changing policy. I, as a psychologist, tend to subscribe to the view that this is a bottom-up effect rather than a top-down effect. The ability to change our latitude to be able to make these changes is going to come in response to a demand that emanates from the population rather than vice versa. And so I do subscribe to the view that the public comes first.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Okay, one of my last questions. This is one I've gotten at. So I live in Fresno, in the Central Valley. We have the highest enlistment in American foreign wars, and the largest number of body bags. So, like when there was the Iraq War, when there was the Afghanistan War, a lot of the high schools around me, there was a lot of newspaper articles. People come back, they didn't make it. And I remember one day during the height of the Iraq War, I ran in and I talked to my dad, and he was a veteran from Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he served during that time. And he goes, "Hey, I saw the new batch." and because he likes going to the VA hospital. He gets to hang out with guys and share war stories and whatever. So he goes, "Hey, I saw the new batch." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "It's the new batch of 25 to 30-year-olds. And they got that same look as the guys that came back with me in Vietnam. They never came back. And some of them do. But then there's other guys at the VA hospital who's like, that dude's gone. He's never returning." Just like some of the non-vets who, to this day, never actually came back home mentally. Is it possible to say the same thing about a nation state? That a nation state can experience so much trauma that it never actually returns home fully, completely.
Yeah.
January 6th, I remember watching that. That's burned into my memory. I can tell you exactly where I was standing, who I was talking to, everything around, and the exact time of day. It reminds me the way I wasn't around, but the way people talk about, where were you when Kennedy was shot? I think the question is now, where were you when January 6th was broadcast on television to the world? And I was helping out my parents, and I was doing some chores, and my mom was like, "Oh, go throw that trash." And I had the trash can in my hand. And then she came back around 5 minutes ago, and she's like, I told you to throw the trash. I go, "Mom, Capitol's being stormed, country's being overthrown." And she's like, "Marcus," because she knows I do politics. She's like, "I don't want to hear about your political opinion. I asked you to throw the trash. Would you go to?" So she's focused on, we're getting done, and I'm upset with my son. And I go, "No, look." And I pointed at the thing, and she dropped the trash can out of her hand and stared there with me for 5 minutes, and we didn't talk. I've never had an experience with that woman like that in my entire life. Is it possible that we could say also, I had two colleagues, both liberals, don't know each other at all, talked to them the day after January 6th. And they said, "Why didn't we line 300 of those people up and gun them down live on television?" They've never talked that way before, ever. Is it possible that people can experience too much trauma as a nation state and never actually come back from it? Because I got to tell you, I saw a lot of behaviors I never saw in my life before from many, many people after January 6th. Is it cool? We'll just get over it. People calm down. Or is this a mini Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, it's I really appreciate the way that you put that. I mean, it's a very provocative analogy to think about national trauma and to think about comparing that to the individual traumas that people have experienced through all the horrific events that have happened over the past 100 years, and wars and natural disasters, etc. And so I think it does raise an important question about whether we can come back from those types of traumatic events. So I have two answers to your question. The first is to look. I mean, look back at the Civil War. We experienced the most horrendous and divisive is a minimal word to describe it. The most wrenching type of trauma that a nation can ever experience, and yet we still exist. We're still here, and so one could say that we did come back from that. But I would then qualify that to say, what does it mean to come back from this type of trauma? I think that you never come back to the same place that you began, where you were before the traumatic event happened. One can only hope that you come back and you are to a new place, to a place of greater understanding, to a place of possibility, of understanding of both the good and the bad, an understanding of what is the level of risk and antipathy that's happening in this country. If we have a better understanding of that, then maybe we can focus our efforts and address it even more rigorously. So I don't think we ever come back from these types of traumas, but I do believe that we have the potential to return to a place of greater that is that moves us forward in this larger journey that we're taking as the American experiment. We're learning from our mistakes, and I think that we have the potential to grow out of these traumatic experiences and become stronger as a result.
I'm curious. I hope so. I'm just curious because there's some historians have said that African Americans, after Martin Luther King got shot and Robert Kennedy and JFK, you had people like James Baldwin, a famous African American writer, saying, the moment these people started standing up for us, they got shot in the head. So maybe we can't actually integrate with white society, or we can't come out as much. And so you had sort of an insular opinion. There was a period after the Civil Rights Movement and the March on Selma were starting to open up. And then 3 top leaders got shot dead after they were talking well. So African Americans were like, wow, these guys talk about us. Next thing I know, they're dead. This is pretty bad. And that's not even to mention the tons of African American leaders, Medgar Evers, who were literally shot dead in their bed in their home. So there was kind of a backlash. That didn't really heal until Obama in 2008, or roughly 50 years later. We can also look at the indigenous trauma of the genocide they went through. I've worked with a lot of indigenous here in California. They're still traumatized and still don't believe in democracy. And I go, how can you not believe in democracy? They go, because you guys voted to kill us for 200 years with free and fair elections. So whatever. And then we can look at the Jewish trauma with the Holocaust, the famous people who experienced the Holocaust and then transferred the trauma onto their children, and then they transferred it onto their grandchildren, going 3 generations. We're looking at 30 to 50 years. We can also look at the Civil War trauma. You can talk about the Civil War trauma then in until like the late 1890s. So the Civil War's over 1866. The country's still a mess. People are still mad. There's this kind of dead period of communication and spirit, according to historians, that lasts another 25 to 30 years. So I'm wondering, yeah, we can get fixed, but what if we're talking about it's the year 2023 and it's not till 2045 when we start turning this around? That's not good, right?
That is not good. It is not good. What if?
Okay, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there. Okay, last minute questions. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. I always want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm trying to understand, and I started this series so that the public could also understand. And it's really helpful when academics come on and they're able to take well, what if this and what if that? It helps the public understand. It helps me understand. And that's the whole point of this. So I really want to appreciate and say thank you for being a little bit flexible. I know it's not the way you guys are professionally trained, but I deeply, deeply appreciate it. I think it helps more understanding. Last 2 questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person who's going to watch this video. You're never going to meet this person. You don't know what they think. They watch this video and they go, wow, I learned a lot. Man, there was this and that. I learned so much information. But there's this one thing the professor said. And while I struggle to remember everything that video was covering, there's this one thing the postdoctorate fellow, I apologize, said. And I can't get that thought out of my head. And it's 5 days after I've watched the video. What's that thought you want a random unknown person to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after they finish watching this video?
We need to turn our attention to the things that actually matter. We need to be sparking our imaginations about the society that we can create. And we need to be having those types of conversations about what world we want to build for ourselves, and stop focusing on defeating our enemies and start thinking about how we can work together to build that world.
Very nice. Very nice. I always love asking that question. I never know what answers I'm going to get. And usually they're very poetic and Shakespearean. That was good. That was good. I hope you found this was a fair interview. I didn't put words in your mouth. You got to say your piece.
No, that's great. I enjoyed it very much.
Do you have any recommendations? They could be an activist. They could be another academic. Anybody who'd be willing to be part of an honest conversation. You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask. We always try to keep the conversation going. If you can think of somebody later, or if you know somebody right now, whatever. But if you can think of anybody, we'd appreciate it. And I hope you felt that this was fair. And anybody you tell us, we will treat fair too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will. I'll think on it, and I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you, postdoctorate fellow. I will email you a copy of the video soon. And I want to say thank you for your time, and thank you for taking some questions that kind of went like this. I really appreciate it. It helps.
Of course, Marcus. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon, and I'll email you shortly.
Take care.
Thank you.